explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason Podcast. This is episode 11. Had some fun last week with y'all. I lived in the South, so I guess I'm allowed to say that. But I had some fun last week doing a live show. Unfortunately, this week I'm back to being pre-recorded. I will be on the narrative right after this airs. I'm recording this on Saturday, so for me it's still tomorrow. This whole informational time travel thing has me a little bit discombobulated. We have about 6 inches of snow on the ground outside. Getting some wintry weather here in November. Kind of unusual. The last number of years have been relatively non-wintry. So it seems like maybe we're getting some winter again here in central Illinois. But back to the regularly scheduled programming here. Tonight is the first episode in a series on Lysander Spooner's trial by jury. We just wrapped up the No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority essay. I have no idea how long this next series will be, but as I've been reading and preparing while still mulling over everything we covered on the previous series on No Treason, I'm discovering a more overarching vision of what Spooner had for what a natural law honoring society would actually look like. And of course, hoping to use that as a guideline as we enter this golden age and have the opportunity to create something for ourselves. As far as an overarching vision, I'm looking into calling it a comprehensive series on natural law. So the first installment, the last 10 weeks that we've spent on the No Treason essay, we could plainly see the failings of the U.S. Constitution and its purported system. And we were able to see a thorough expose on how our enemy actually wields its power. The blood money loan mongers loan vast sums of money to their despotic tools, the secret band of robbers and murderers who, in their arrogance, claim to be our government, and who use their promise to rob us via taxation as collateral for those loans. This secret band of robbers and murderers, secret by virtue of the secret ballot, seizes absolute and irresponsible power, which is the right of property, over all of us, and demonstrates as often as is necessary its ruthless willingness to kill and destroy whatever and whoever it needs to in order to protect its grip on power. But of course, such displays are expensive. And as such, this pecuniary relationship between the loan mongers and our government demonstrates coldly that all political power, as it is called, rests on the matter of money. Trial by jury is the next piece of this puzzle, showing us how justice can be properly rendered without a totalitarian, centralized, and authoritarian state. And if you're anything like me, then going through Spooner's arguments will reveal just how deeply rooted statism actually is in our hearts. The idea that we as the people could literally take the law into our own hands through the trial by jury system is something we are programmed to recoil against. And I think this reveals that while we say we want government of, for, and by the people, when it comes down to it, at least right now, we don't really mean it. Trial by jury as a concept truly puts to the test our commitment to liberty and self-governance. And as we dig into all of Spooner's arguments, this idea that I've been sort of thinking about will hopefully be more fleshed out as far as what I mean by statism being rooted in our hearts. Since all political power, as it is called, rests on the matter of money, then it is absolutely worthwhile in thinking of this comprehensive view or comprehensive series on natural law. I think it's worthwhile to discuss Spooner's essay entitled Poverty, Its Illegal Causes and Legal Cure. And we'll get to that once we are through with trial by jury, because in that essay, Spooner lays out a well thought out and fascinating theory of money that he developed after witnessing firsthand the catastrophe inherent in fractional reserve banking that was on full display during the Panic of 1837, which I touched on in our discussion on the causes of the Civil War. Somewhere in all of that, I'll make sure to do a deeper dive on property rights and natural law. I've obviously touched on that a number of times, but I think a more focused episode or two dedicated to those topics is certainly in order. And then in keeping with the promise of this show to hit on other topics besides just the political ones, any topic, as I mentioned in my first episode, that's treasonous to the central narrative. Polymathonon and I are still planning on doing a primer series on Aether Physics, and we're still kind of doing prep work for that. I'm as I get time, working in my garage workshop and making a housing for the ferrocell. That's the magnetic field viewer that I've talked about. And once I have that operational, even before we get into our show, I'll take a few minutes and display it off a little bit. But Polymath is doing some more research and refresh on the topic, and finding some rediscovering old insights and finding new ones as he digs into a lot of the source material on that's been put forth by various physicists over the decades. We might do a teaser episode before too long, just to kind of introduce the topics, or maybe a segment here and there. But we're still working through that, and I want to get through this trial by jury stuff before we really shift gears and focus on different things. But before we get into the rest of tonight's episode, we have a few ads. First up is Pet Club.
Science proves that a healthy immune system is the body's first defense against the smallest of ailments to the most catastrophic. Coriolus versicolor is the most sought-after, all-natural supplement for both humans and pets to help boost the immune system. There are over 400 studies worldwide on its effectiveness in humans, including Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and now from the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine. Together, we can help reverse this terrible tide now plaguing your loved ones and give them the immune-boosting supplements that they need.
I've said before that dogs make me use a voice I'm not proud of. So definitely check out Pet Club if you care about your pets and want to treat them with things that are not toxic for them. Next up, we have Badlands Shop. When your favorite Badlands show wraps up without a raid, visit the Badlands website to explore our incredible sponsors. From products featured on the show to kickstarting your shopping list, the Badlands Shop has you covered. Every purchase you make is a powerful vote for the future you believe in. We make it easy to shop America first, supporting Badlands creators and patriot small businesses that champion freedom. You're not just buying a product. You are fueling a movement with every dollar spent. Thank you for supporting businesses that support Badlands Media. Head over to badlandsmedia.tv and click Shop from the menu, or go directly to badlandsmedia.tv/shop. And with every purchase you make being a powerful vote for the future you believe in, I would say that's voting that Lysander Spooner would actually think was worthwhile. Excuse me. All right, last ad, we've got
Soft disclosure, just dropped new favorites for the season. The lotion, your 5-ounce favorite, is still here. And now we've added full 11-ounce bottles. New Lavender Tea Tree Deodorant. Clean, calm, and effective. New tallow bars. Chamomile Lemon Rose and Naked. Rich moisture that actually works. And on Black Friday, the new arrivals land. Introducing our first men's only formula, beard oil, in unscented and spiced vanilla. Truth, tamed, and finally your beard is too. Tallow lip balms, made with beef tallow and lanolin for serious moisture. Available in chamomile mint, vanilla, naked, and vanilla tangerine. Plus, mini tallow bars, same deep moisture as the full size. Available in vanilla coffee and naked. And finally, lavender vanilla lotion. Smooth, soothing, and worth the wait. On Black Friday, the new products arrive, and so do the Black Friday bundles. Visit softdisclosure.com for truth you can gift.
Soft disclosure.
All right, we are getting into a new series now, Trial by Jury. We're basing this off of the essay entitled An Essay on the Trial by Jury, which Spooner wrote in 1852. It's interesting when you read his writings over the decades. There are, I think the earliest one that I've read is from the 1840s, and then all the way up into the 1880s. The consistency that the man had in his overall philosophy and the insights that he was able to plumb out of it by applying his impeccable logic and reason is pretty impressive. So here we are reading from 1852. This would have been about, 18 years prior to No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority, and we have a coherent consistency through all out. It's about 185 pages or so in the PDF that I have linked in the description. So it's called an essay, but it's more like a book. 12 chapters and an appendix, and each of the chapters, or many of the chapters, have subsections within them that makes it easy to kind of break down. It contains a comprehensive history of the practice of jury trials, a natural law basis for the authority of the practice, commentary on how it has been usurped even in Spooner's day, which we can use as a springboard to discuss how it has been usurped even since then. And then there's handling various objections and so on. So it's a completely comprehensive treatise, if you will, on trial by jury as a practice. And I think it's incredibly important, as we'll get into, as being, as it's referred to in many different writings, as the palladium of liberty. And we'll just explore what that actually means. But tonight we'll be discussing section 1 of chapter 1, which the title is the chapter is entitled "The Right of Juries to Judge of the Justice of Laws." So it's kind of getting straight to the heart of the point of a jury trial system. As far as being part of the founding ethos of this country, obviously trial by jury is codified in the Constitution in 3 separate places. But it was also mentioned in the Declaration of Independence in the list of grievances against King George. And where it is mentioned, it says, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury. We'll see, once we especially get into the history that Spooner lays out, that in the context of English law or common law, trial by jury as a concept was a long-standing and inherent right that the founding fathers were acutely aware of. So it wasn't just some new concept that Spooner was playing around with, or even that the founding fathers were playing around with. They were appealing to something that by their time was already quite ancient. John Adams wrote about trial by jury a number of times, and I pulled a quote that I found from his 1765 dissertation on the canon and feudal law, and he wrote, "It is the grand endeavor of all those who have ever attempted the destruction of liberties of this country to subvert the trial by jury." So ever since its foundation or formation, the trial by jury has been attacked by governing authorities because they recognize that it is an inherent blockage on their exercise of power. John Adams, I read that. John Adams wrote that in 1765. There's another one that he wrote in the 1770s that I didn't pull a quote from, but he had a number of different writings, also from his private diaries and letters. I found a number of instances where he referred to trial by jury, and he was one of many of the founding fathers that I was able to find that out. Ben Franklin wrote in a letter, "I am persuaded that the people are more capable of judging of facts and that they are less liable to corruption than judges. In fact, it is the people themselves who are to judge in the trial by jury." Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death fame, wrote or spoke in his one of his floor speeches in the Virginia House when debating the ratification of the Constitution, which he was against, by the way. He wrote spoke that one of the best securities to public liberty is the trial by jury. Trial by jury is the best appendage of freedom. I hope that we shall never be induced to part with that excellent mode of trial. I wish politicians today would speak in such poetic language, speaking of things as being an appendage of freedom. If you're going to have a TV show, at least have good writing. And then, of course, in the Constitution, like I mentioned, it's referred to 3 times. You have Article 3, Section 2, Clause 3. But then the Anti-Federalists weren't satisfied with that. So James Madison drafted the 6th and 7th Amendments, which both mention the trial by jury, to flesh out more what was meant, because it was argued by the Anti-Federalists that the small mentioning that trial by jury had in the Constitution wasn't sufficient enough to protect it from encroachment by the government. The argument from the Federalists was that each state had its own conception of trial by jury. In many of the state constitutions, trial by jury is mentioned explicitly. And so their argument was, well, it's already mentioned in the other states, and so we don't have to mention it here. But that wasn't satisfactory to the Anti-Federalists. You're welcome to do your own research to flesh out all of that. But in Spooner's mind, the trial by jury system is the pinnacle of a natural law society. It's a true test of human sovereignty, and as such is a key ingredient in a sovereign people keeping its government in check. It is the most tangible way for there to even be such a thing as a legitimate government of, for, and by the people. And really, based on Spooner's history of the practice, it seems evident to me that the most free that man has ever been is during the times when he understood collectively, obviously collectively meaning individually combined, the importance of trial by jury or trial by country, as it is also called, and not just understood it, but exercised that authority. I've poked at the ridiculous notion that the U.S. Constitution is the crowning achievement of mankind's struggle for political liberty, which is the way it was taught to me when I was growing up. But it turns out that Europeans had figured out the answer to man's struggle for political liberty at least 1,500 years ago, if not longer. And I mentioned that it's also called trial by country, and I'll explain more as we get to Spooner's writings about that in a little bit. Now, among many other subversions, we have been duped into believing that of, for, and by the people is primarily and virtually, singularly, it's a lot of ly words I put there, but that's all right. I like to stretch my tongue as much as I can. So it's the act of voting is the primary and singular accomplished by, let me start over. We've been duped into believing, I'm working on just a few hours of sleep here, so you got to cut me some slack. We've been duped into believing that of, for, and by the people, that's what our government's supposed to be, is primarily and virtually singularly accomplished by taking part in a humiliation ritual every 2, 4, or 6 years. And of course, speaking of the electoral process, but voting can never be the safeguard of liberty. On the one hand, if you think about it. It's just simply sloughing off of the moral individual responsibility that we all have of maintaining a just community to some overly eager stranger who, even by seeking the office and the powers that come with it, is probably demonstrating enough reason why they shouldn't have it in the first place. And then on the other hand, Spooner weighs in with this quote, which is actually from section 2, but I'm including it here. He writes, neither is it of any avail to say that if the government abuse its power and enact unjust and oppressive laws, the government may be changed by the influence of discussion and the exercise of the right of suffrage, that is voting. Discussion can do nothing to prevent the enactment or procure the repeal of unjust laws unless it be understood that the discussion is to be followed by resistance. Tyrants care nothing for discussions that are to end only in discussion. And this speaks to comments that I made last week about how the concessions that the Bill of Rights were, in light of the borrowing and taxing clause, were concessions that the deep state were quite happy to make. Discussions which do not interfere with the enforcement of their laws are but idle wind to them. Suffrage is equally powerless and unreliable. It can be exercised only periodically, and the tyranny must at least be borne until the time for suffrage comes. Besides, when the suffrage is exercised, it gives no guarantee for the repeal of existing laws that are oppressive, and no security against the enactment of new ones that are equally so. The second body of legislators are liable and likely to be just as tyrannical as the first, and this echoes sentiments that Spooner had in our discussion on the speech and debate clause. If it be said that the second body may be chosen for their integrity, the answer is that the first were chosen for that very reason, and yet proved tyrants. The second will be exposed to the same temptations as the first, and will be just as likely to prove tyrannical. What is the expression that power corrupts? And total power corrupts totally, or something to that effect. Who ever heard that succeeding legislatures were, on the whole, more honest than those that preceded them? What is there in the nature of men or things to make them so? If it be said that the first body were chosen from motives of injustice, that fact proves that there is a portion of society who desire to establish injustice, and if they were powerful or artful enough to procure the election of their instruments to compose the first legislature, they will be likely to be powerful or artful enough to procure the election of the same or similar instruments to compose the second. The right of suffrage, therefore, and even a change of legislators, guarantees no change of legislation. Certainly no change for the better. Even if a change for the better actually comes, it comes too late, because it comes only after more or less injustice has been irreparably done. But with a trial by jury system, there is no need to wait until a new legislative season, or wait until the right person is finally elected. And to that point, Spooner writes, in this way, that is with the trial by jury, the people at all times hold their liberties in their own hands and never surrender them, even for a moment, into the hands of the government. And how is this possible? What is it about a trial by jury, or trial by country, as Spooner also calls it, that is so effective? We'll be digging into all of the particulars about that, but here is the entire premise in a nutshell. For more than 600 years, that is since Magna Carta in 1215, there has been no clearer principle of English or American constitutional law than that in criminal cases it is not only the right and duties of juries to judge what are the facts, what is the law, and what was the moral intent of the accused, but that it is also their right and their primary and paramount duty to judge of the justice of the law, and to hold all laws invalid that are, in their opinion, unjust or oppressive, and all persons guiltless in violating or resisting the execution of such laws. In other words, juries adjudicate not just the person charged, but the law under which they are charged. So the concept being a randomly selected panel of 12 men, historically, are elevated in the context of the trial to essentially be the definitive law of the land in that moment. The required unanimity of the 12 random men makes it such that no law, no legislation, no decree, no mandate, no edict can be enforced as law unless all 12 conclusively agree that it be so. Therefore, no king, no congressman, no president, no judge, no senator has a higher authority than those 12 men in that moment, because they are definitively representing the people. This fact alone is one of the most compelling because it is based firmly in natural rights that we are all born with and the inherent duty to uphold natural law that comes with those rights, which we'll get into as we discuss more deeply the concept of natural rights and natural law and all that. And this is all interwoven all throughout. And then, most importantly, in my mind, after a trial, this impromptu government, if you will, this impromptu law of the land, they don't linger. They don't keep joining new juries at their own will. They don't campaign. They don't hold court with the press. They don't create a dynasty. They don't create and staff independent agencies and regulate commerce and any of that nonsense. They render their verdict, and then they disappear back into the masses, back to their normal lives until the random lot should call on them again. So let's examine the right and the role of juries even further. The claim is that a jury judges the law itself, and necessarily so. Unless such be the right and duty of jurors, it is plain that instead of juries being a palladium of liberty, a barrier against the tyranny and oppression of the government, they are really mere tools in its hands for carrying into execution any injustice and oppression it may desire to have executed. So if this is not the right of the jury, that is to judge the law itself, then there is no point in participating in the charade of a jury trial at all, or deluding ourselves in thinking that a jury trial is anything special. If those 12 people are just going to parrot what an illegitimate government declares is law, then what is their function other than public deception? The deception being, of course, that we have a government of, for, and by the people. What is going on other than a simple, or rather complex, show trial? Spooner writes, but for their right to judge the law and the justice of the law, juries would be no protection to an accused person, even as to matters of fact. For if the government can dictate to a jury any law whatever in a criminal case, it can certainly dictate to them the laws of evidence. That is, it can dictate what evidence is admissible and what is inadmissible, and also what force or weight is to be given to the evidence admitted. And if the government can thus dictate to a jury the laws of evidence, it can not only make it necessary for them to convict on a partial exhibition of the evidence rightfully pertaining to the case, but it can even require them to convict on any evidence whatever that it pleases to offer them. So does this sound at all like what we have today? I would say Spooner may as well be describing our exact predicament. And with Trump's pardon of Tina Peters bringing her case back into public consciousness, the Colorado governor in a tweet had the gall to say that Tina Peters was convicted by a jury of her peers, indicating that the people had spoken. But that vile tyrant knows that in her trial, the judge did not permit her to present evidence that would have aided in her defense. The judge decided what evidence was admissible. And therefore the jury, and gave the jury explicit instructions. And that's what happens in basically any jury trial in our time. These are bastardizations of the trial by jury system. And their existence means that we do not have the ultimate protection of a jury trial that a jury trial is meant to offer. The Tina Peters trial is a perfect example of the importance of the concept of having a jury be the final say. And it's a perfect example of how it was historically, and therefore how Spooner presents it. And what the trial by jury system is actually providing for us then is a choice between a trial by government or a trial by jury, i.e. trial by country. And Spooner says to that effect, the trial by jury then is a trial by the country, that is by the people, as distinguished from a trial by the government. We talk about it having a government of, for, and by the people, and that is most realized in a trial by jury system. Spooner puts it this way: the object of this trial by country or by the people in preference to a trial by the government is to guard against every species of oppression by the government. In order to effect this end, it is indispensable that the people or the country judge of and determine their own liberties against the government, instead of the government's judging of and determining its own powers over the people. How is it possible that juries can do anything to protect the liberties of the people against the government if they are not allowed to determine what those liberties are? If we have a government that governs by the consent of the governed, that is most blatantly exemplified in a jury literally declaring a law to be null and void because they don't agree with the law. And this is why this topic is so important, especially the deeper you understand the concepts of natural law. We are juxtaposing two diametrically opposed perspectives on government. Government is either the protector of liberty, protector of property, of justice, and it does so by the expressed will of the people, according to boundaries established by the people, with the most effective means being the discovery of law through the jury trial, which is the essence of what was meant historically by the phrase common law, by the way. It wasn't necessarily that there was an arbitrary set of rules that was established, but in vein of what Spooner describes natural law being, it's more that people discovered these things being law and then decided to implement them in society. So we're juxtaposing that whole aspect with government deciding on its own what its limitations are. It decides on its own who is, again, guilty or innocent. It decides on its own in a trial what does or doesn't count as evidence, or what does and doesn't count as an argument, or what is or isn't relevant. And this is why the Tina Peters trial is a perfect example of how far astray we really have gone. Because in that trial, the judge, essentially as an avatar of the government, decided that the evidence and testimony that Tina Peters wanted to show the jury that would have exonerated her, explaining her own motivations and why she did what she did, that would have explained her actions and motivations. All of that was irrelevant, according to the judge. In other words, the judge performed a role that is, according to the trial by jury system, the sole prerogative of the jury. The jury being a randomized sampling of the people and thus the country. And this all but guaranteed her conviction, since by the letter of the statute, she was technically guilty. And to that point, Spooner writes that the jury must also judge of the laws of evidence. If the government can dictate to a jury the laws of evidence, it can not only shut out any evidence it pleases, tending to vindicate the accused, that is the evidence that would be exculpatory, but it can require that any evidence whatever that it pleases to offer be held as conclusive proof of any offense whatever which the government chooses to allege. So if the government can control the evidence, if the government can control what is relevant, then the government basically can create its own case and instruct the jury to only abide by the things it says are true. But the whole purpose of a trial by jury system is that you as an individual under natural law have an innate understanding of what is or isn't lawful, and under your own reason and your own wisdom and your own experience, be able to contemplate and evaluate evidence. You don't need someone to instruct you on what is or isn't convincing to you. That's something that you inherently know in and of yourself. So by excluding testimony and evidence showing that the voting machines were vulnerable, which would have shown that Tina Peters was acting in good faith to catch a crime in the act, the judge effectively eliminated the entire basis for a jury trial in the first place. But it achieved the narrative of a jury trial so that the governor could act as if the people had spoken. But the people hadn't spoken. 12 people, yes, sat on a jury, but they basically did exactly as they were told by a despot in a ridiculous black robe, which brings to my mind Spooner's scathing sarcasm in No Treason when mocking the various gewgaws and pomp that the statists love to shower themselves with. So the Tina Peters trial is then, in my mind, less about election integrity, because I don't believe a thing ultimately actually matters. It's more about the integrity of the trial by jury system. It is a microcosm on a national stage, especially as I mentioned with Trump's pardon, bringing it back to the spotlight, of the dichotomy between trial by country versus trial by government. And Spooner shows us the difference. He writes, any government that is its own judge of and determines authoritatively for the people what are its own powers over the people is an absolute government, of course. This, of course, brings to mind the absolute and irresponsible power, which is the right of property. It has all the powers that it chooses to exercise. There is no other, or at least no more accurate definition of a despotism than this. On the other hand, any people that judge of and determine authoritatively for the government what are their own liberties against the government, of course retain all the liberties they wish to enjoy. And this is freedom. At least it is freedom to them, because although it may be theoretically imperfect, it nevertheless corresponds to their highest notions of freedom. If you think about what we are told about the Constitution and what it's supposed to represent, this goes back to the idea of a social contract, and that we as the people decided what boundaries the government is going to exist in. But then now you have something like the Tina Peters trial, where the judge is telling the people what their liberties essentially are as a jury and how far we've come. And I would point to Tina Peters, obviously the ramifications compared to something like the Civil War, rather opposite ends of the extremes there, but demonstrates the same thing as that the Civil War demonstrated, that the federal government, or even really the state governments, because they're all just copies of each other, doesn't care about our liberty and doesn't care about our freedom. It only cares about its own power through the borrowing and taxing regime that they have implemented. And that's why the Tina Peters trial is so important in this context. So going back to the material here, what is a trial by country? We're now going to sort of slide through his arguments for what the trial by country actually is, the trial by jury. Considering its goal to retain all the liberties they wish to enjoy, and that's from that quote there. A jury is a security to secure this right of the people to judge of their own liberties against the government. The jurors are taken, or must be, to make them lawful jurors, from the body of the people by lot, that is, by random, or by some process that precludes any previous knowledge, choice, or selection of them on the part of the government. The reasons for this are obvious. If the government could, it would pack a jury with people predisposed to support its claims and interpretations. And that's why the Tina Peters trial is an important example. And hers is one of probably millions of trials that have occurred ever since they've been subverting the trial by jury system, which I'm still doing research into that, but it seems like at least since the 1830s, there has been an aggressive move by the judicial system to curtail the powers of a jury. The selection by lot or by random is a key component because it is supposed that if 12 men be taken by lot from the mass of the people without the possibility of any previous knowledge, choice, or selection of them on the part of the government, the jury will be a fair epitome of the country at large, and not merely of the party or faction that sustains the measures of the government. So being a randomized sampling of the country, there is significant chance that substantially all classes of opinions prevailing among the people will be represented in the jury. This could be statist sympathizers, libertarians, run-of-the-mill just want to live their lives and raise their family types. All manner of people have equal opportunity or chance of being represented in a jury. But the impact of a jury selected in such a manner is that it is fairly presumable that such a tribunal will agree to no conviction except such as substantially the whole country would agree to if they were present, taking part in the trial. A trial by such a tribunal there is, therefore, in effect, a trial by the country, and that is what Spooner means when he talks about jury trial being a trial by country. And further, as unanimity is required for conviction, it follows that no one can be convicted except for the violation of such laws as substantially the whole country wish to have maintained. And now, at first glance, this has the appearance of a form of majority rule, but as we'll see, there's a whole chapter devoted to that topic. It's something that Spooner specifically eschews. But in thinking through natural law as being reality of human interaction as God created it to be, that the law of God is written on all of our hearts, and that natural law in its elemental form is something which even children can discover on their own. In fact, they can't even learn and understand the words that we have to describe things like mine and lying or honesty without already understanding the concepts behind them. It is therefore then logical to think that as far as natural rights and their protections are concerned, only that which the whole of the people agree upon has any chance at all of being legally binding and thus enforceable. So the system of a trial by jury, especially with the unanimity aspect, is essentially provides us the best odds at getting at something being truly part of natural law, and thus something that is truly worthy of being enforceable. And as such, the government, therefore, consistently with the trial by jury, can exercise no powers over the people, or what is the same thing, over the accused person who represents the rights of the people, except such as substantially the whole country, people of the country consent that it may exercise. In such a trial, therefore, the country or the people judge of and determine their own liberties against the government, instead of the government's judging of and determining its own powers over the people. So the main issue at play in a trial by jury system is the very nature of government itself, and you might have already picked up on that. It is, more than any other thing, the actual embodiment of what we like to talk about, of government being of, for, and by the people. Do we govern ourselves, or are we governed by an unaccountable institution? The jury trial really brings this thought to the forefront, because you will not find yourself in such a trial unless you have crossed or transgressed some boundary. And you have no need to fear such a trial unless you have crossed or transgressed some boundary that the whole of the people agree should be. In a trial by government scenario, they, that is the government, an arbitrary judge who may or may not be bought off, determine an arbitrary set of rules by which to try, convict, and then punish you. Whereas in a trial by jury scenario, your peers judge you essentially by natural law. They can be advised as to what the written code may or may not be, but because they have the right to judge that written code as well as you, and if it's not something that they inherently agree to as being something that they understand as being the way nature actually is, then you have a better chance of living in a sense of freedom and liberty. The government's overreach, or if you have acted already in accordance with natural law, then you are de facto innocent, regardless of how the government pleads its case. And all you need is one person to agree with you in order to have that assurance. The government's overreach is therefore effectively cut off if a jury refuses to enforce its mandates. So as such, the jury are also to judge whether the laws are rightly expounded to them by the court. The judge may advise his or her opinion, but each juror, by virtue of natural law, is capable of deciding on their own what is or is not lawful. That's the entire premise behind government of, for, and by the people. Again, the people being shorthand to describe all of us. To that point, the jury must also judge whether there really be any such law, be it good or bad, as the accused is charged having transgressed. The government may do its best to inflate the quantity of laws by which they insist we must live, and of course that gets thrown around a lot, that they have no idea how many actually exist at this point. But the jury is the point at which the people decide whether they will or will not submit to them. So in a trial situation, the prosecution may be like, oh, look at this random obscure code that was written 50 years ago and this person violated it. And the jury can be like, yeah, that's a dumb rule. We're not enforcing that. And I don't care how many times you point to it, we're not enforcing it. So a person may be guilty by the letter of the government's law, i.e. their fiat decree, such as Tina Peters actually or technically is. But the jury may decide if the law should even exist as it is written, or if there are extenuating circumstances which may negate the letter of the law, such as witnessing a crime taking place and then technically breaking the law in order to try to stop the crime. And then, as has already been mentioned, but I'll mention it again, the jury must also judge the laws of evidence. If this is not true, then we are doomed to an existence of authority by fiat, authority by expert, authority by the science, authority by the whims of easily bought majorities, easily manipulated majorities. When it comes down to what you will or will not accept as evidence, you are the judge of your own willingness to accept something as true or not. It's utterly absurd to think that someone else can tell you what you think is reasonable. That's something that only you can know about yourself, and it's something that only you can decide for yourself. And when you sit on a jury, you're being called to exercise your judgment based on what is presented to you, not someone else's judgment, your judgment. This is why the government hates and has always hated the trial by jury system, because of that exact fact. It is manifest, therefore, that the jury must judge of and try the whole case and every part and parcel of the case, free of any dictation or authority on the part of the government. They must judge of the existence of the law, of the true exposition of the law, of the justice of the law, and of the admissibility and weight of all the evidence offered. Otherwise, the government will have everything its own way. The jury will be mere puppets in the hands of the government. Tina Peters' trial. And the trial will be, in reality, a trial by the government and not a trial by the country. By such trials, the government will determine its own powers over the people instead of the people's determining their own liberties against the government. And it will be an entire delusion to talk, as for centuries we have done, of the trial by jury as a palladium of liberty or as any protection to the people against the oppression and tyranny of the government. The question then between trial by jury, as thus described, and trial by government is simply a question between liberty and despotism. If the authority be vested in the government is absolute, and the people have no liberties except such as the government sees fit to indulge them with. If, on the other hand, that authority be vested in the people, then the people have all liberties as against the government, except such as substantially the whole people, through a jury, choose to disclaim. And the government can exercise no power except such as substantially the whole people, through a jury, consent that it may exercise. As the Tina Peters trial demonstrates, unless the trial by jury system be consistent with its historical purpose and practice, it is nothing more than a deceptive pageantry. But if it is what it claims to be, and is practiced according to what it claims to be, and it must be if we are to believe we live in a country of, for, and by the people, by the way, as I keep saying, then the trial by jury system represents the most direct and practical means by which a people can essentially starve a government of its power and stare it directly in the face and simply say, no. The jury in that moment is effectively the actual government. The jury, then, is the only means by which the people can actually govern free from any lobbying, manipulation, etc. Next week, as we get into the second section of Chapter 1, we'll dig more into the implications of a trial by jury system on the constitutional framework of government. And I'm still digging through that, but of course, Spooner has a lot of interesting things to say. But you can already see this is something that has some pretty severe consequences. And just from what we've covered so far, the attack on the trial by jury system, which is unfortunately but perfectly exemplified in the Tina Peters trial and travesty. The reason why the government attacks it so hard and why they have worked very hard every generation to chip away and chip away and chip away, but then also why they have kept the shell of it, because it provides that perfect narrative framework, that perfect shielding, to use the Burning Bright terminology, that the governor was able to use to act as if the people had actually had a say in what happened to Tina Peters. If the people had actually had a say in what happened to Tina Peters, it would have gone much differently, I'm quite sure. And really, we probably wouldn't have been in a situation where she would have been on trial in the first place if we actually had a working trial by jury system. This is why I'm so passionate about this. The system is screwed up. I don't know that we can necessarily change the system, but as long as we have the shell of it, I say we use it as much as we possibly can. And the best way, I think, going forward is to educate ourselves and others about what power we actually can wield when we sit on a jury, which is why I tell people, when you get that summons, don't try to get out of it. this is our way to, again, stare the government straight in the face and be like, yeah, screw off. But with that, I'll go ahead and end it. By the time this goes live, I will be gearing up to get on with Burning Bright on the narrative. So I will see you in just a few minutes in that chat. I appreciate you all hanging out with me, and I'm looking forward to the rest of this series as we get into it. So take care.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.